share his thoughts with us.
The Honorable Comptroller and Auditor General of India, the Honorable Deputy Comptroller and Auditor General of India, members of the Audit fraternity, as the CAG chose to address you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm conscious of the fact that this is the concluding session of your long conference. I'm also conscious of the fact that at times when you have a 3-day conference, listening to long speeches becomes a reasonably boring activity. And therefore, for some of us who are used to speaking, I've always felt that whereas you enjoy speaking, it's quite painful at times to continue to listen. And therefore, I'm going to be a little short and crisp, keeping that limitation in mind. The Auditor General mentioned that amongst the 4 subjects, emerging areas of audit is what you discussed. And the needs of the audit was the second subject that he mentioned just now. He started with a comment that audit is an essential requirement of good governance. Well, I've always wondered to myself, barring the last 2 years, if with average to moderate, and at times even below moderate governance, India had a capacity to grow by 8 or 9%, if we had followed the best practices and displayed the highest standards of good governance, probably our levels of growth would have been even more exemplary. Yes, you are right that audit is a requirement of good governance, essentially because any form of accountability and transparency are essential to good governance itself. If accountability and transparency were not there in governance, and questions were not asked, in fact, uncomfortable questions at times were not asked, governance would tend to become despotic. And therefore, in any system of governance, there have to be various layers of accountability. And this in itself is an unquestionable proposition. I've been in public life now for a reasonably long time. This is my second tenure in government. And I can assure you that except for routine decisions, when such subject matters confront us, which involve the exercise of a discretion, the impact that this accountability has had on governance is apparent from what goes on, at least in my mind. how do I exercise this discretion? Do I just make an unreasoned comment on the file? Or must whatever I say be informed by reasons? Today, every word I write could be accepted under the Information Act. Tomorrow, a court could summon the file in exercise of its jurisdiction to exercise judicial review and ask a question as to the basis of a decision. The auditor could ask us on what basis was this decision, which had a financial implication, taken. And therefore, it's essential that every administrator bears in mind that there is no absolute discretion left. Every act of discretion is circumstanced by a sense of logic or reasoning which must accompany it. Not only must there be reasons which inform that decision, the reasons will have to be cogent. The reasons must include the relevant. They must certainly exclude the irrelevant. And if out of two views, which may be logically possible, one view has been preferred, it must be indicated as to what prevailed in the decision maker's mind, that one view itself was taken. If these elementary requirements are borne in mind, you take a giant step in the direction of good governance. And thereafter, whether it's the CAG or it's the public at large through the Information Act, or it's a judicial authority exercising review, perhaps would be circumspect in taking an adverse view on that decision, because the possible view has been taken through a correct decision-making mechanism. It's never the decision that is questioned. It's the fairness of a decision-making process which is questioned. And it's therefore extremely important that every administrator bear in mind that fairness of the decision-making process must appear on record. It's not necessary that the reasons are prevalent in your mind. The reasons must be disclosed itself. And it's only then that you are able to maintain reasonable standards of governance in the country. It is therefore a logical conclusion then to take that those who review the decision are not adversarial to you. They are natural adjuncts of the fact that the decision making is intended to be corrected, and if those in governance have a tendency to fall into error, then those who review with the wisdom of hindsight can certainly make you wiser as far as the future is concerned. If you look at the growth of all the new areas, and I'll take the illustration which you suggested as one of the key subjects. How did we reach this layer itself? Post-independence in the decade of 1950s, 60s, these concepts did not exist. There was almost a presumption that if the executive decided, it must have had reasons for deciding it. all the institutions which have now been created and which have now evolved and followed, created their own discipline, very rarely questioned those decisions and expressed an adversarial view. I look back at those decades that since we just achieved independence, national unity, sovereignty, these were very important issues. And therefore, those in the reviewing arena always gave to the governors a benefit of the doubt, because the priority was elsewhere. It's a little later that we started maturing. Our law and constitution never said that you can't be arbitrary. And in fact, an uninformed reason which could be arbitrary in the decade of the 50s and 60s would never have been questioned. It was only in the early 70s where in one of the landmark judgments the Supreme Court said, how do you read absence of arbitrariness as essential? Arbitrariness, they said, is the antithesis of equality because it's the antithesis of fairness. And therefore, it was the whole concept of fairness as part of our administrative law and part of our administrative governance was born for the first time. So if you are not going to be arbitrary and you must follow standards of fairness, then the decision has to be informed by reasons. Those reasons must be logical, they must be cogent. And that is now the school of thought which, from the point of view of civilized governance, has emerged as an essential requirement of good governance. And that is how audit post the decision has become a natural and a logical adjunct to good governance itself. Through those decades, almost for 60 years, we thought, and I come to your new areas, allotment of natural resources and dealing with natural resources is a discretion of the state. And therefore, as we emerged, particularly in the decade of 90s when licensing came to an end, some of us very enthusiastically thought that with licensing coming to an end, with the involvement of state in commercial decisions taking a step backwards, discretions would end and perhaps standards of probity would be much higher. In those areas that did happen. But then, environmental permissions, allocations of natural resources, implementation of large projects, methodology of allotment of those large projects, the entire gambit of public procurement. This is where a large part of the state resource itself is spent. And therefore, one after the other, we started moving into these areas. And we've learned the hard way. Can we today consider allocation of large projects by a procedure which is not just fair and reasonable? Can we arbitrarily pick a name out of the hat and say, this should be allotted to so-and-so? Obviously, it's extremely difficult to do so. The system will not countenance this. Therefore, allotment of every project by a process which necessarily involves tendering is necessary. Both in the spectrum case and the coal case. We've learned that natural resources also and their allocation is not the prerogative of the state to choose the methodology itself. Valuable resources cannot be allocated without value being realized. And valuable resources cannot be allocated to whoever you want. You can have a criteria for narrowing the range of beneficiaries, such as actual users, but you cannot pick and choose who it is to be allotted to. The standards of fairness would have to be necessarily there. We paid actually for that learning process a very heavy price. Contracts have been cancelled. The power sector in the country is even today suffering. When we were working on the recent ordinance, we made sure that the first category is those which are instruments of the state at the center or the state governments, so that those power sector companies necessarily get the coal resource to be able to function. The actual users is the second category, whom can get it only by a process of e-auctioning. They must necessarily have to pay. And the beneficiaries of that payment in this case is going to be the state governments, which fortunately for us in some of the cases are state governments towards the eastern part of India, mostly constituting of the tribal states and West Bengal, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Orissa, West Bengal, which will become beneficiaries of the resource that comes into the system. And therefore, we've learned the hard way. We've sent signals which actually ended up in a transient manner, giving a setback to the economy. But then the element of fairness into a process of allocation itself has now been introduced. And while we've all got wiser, and when you discuss the emerging areas, the needs of audit, you said, the capacity building, I think the auditor also has to realize that the auditor has a natural advantage. That the auditor is not exercising his discretion in taking a decision. The auditor is reviewing through a magnifying glass the decision which has already been taken. And therefore, for anyone to be wiser after the decision is a far easier job. And therefore, the auditor has to exercise his discretion in his capacity building, that he doesn't build his capacity in such a manner that he, in fact, must necessarily find out something which may not exist. He has to be an active auditor. But activism and restraint are always two sides of the same coin. He must be conscious of the fact that he is reviewing a decision which has already been taken. Have the fair procedures been followed? He doesn't have to sensationalize. He doesn't have to get into the headlines. He has to scrutinize thoroughly the decision-making process. He has to necessarily eliminate the possibility of any form of nepotism that may have been exercised. He must have the ability to distinguish between a possible view which may have now been proved wrong and a corrupt view. If he finds that it's a corrupt view, then the level of discretion that he exercises in commenting has to be at an entirely different standard. If he finds that two views were possible and his own view is probably different, he then has to have a more liberal approach. Because let us also not forget that we live in a society which by temperament, having learned the hard way the last few years, has become an over-suspicious society. And therefore, our job is not to convert public opinion into a kind of a lynch mob. Our job really is to create rationality even in the reviewing process. And when we create rationality in the reviewing process, we spare a decision which palpably looks an arbitrary decision, a decision which is not fair, a decision which is not honest, and we leave some element of benefit of doubt for a decision where two possible views are possible. But we can always lay down guidelines of wisdom as far as the future is concerned. I have recently had, as a result of the various experiences we've had, a few observations to make. The system has to continue to function. The CAGs had the benefit of being the Defense Secretary, Government of India. It's not a bad idea to have Defense Secretaries as future CAGs, because they will always realize that people are scared to take decisions for dangers of a future review. And this is an experience wherein meeting after meeting, observation after observation in the file, I observe a tendency to pass the buck so that decisions are not taken during my period, because decisions could be adversely commented upon. I think it's here that a conference like yours has to realize that are we to be merely involved in an environment and aid to an environment of finger pointing? Or are we to do our job in a straightforward manner where questionable decisions must certainly be questioned? But an environment of finger pointing cannot be allowed to replace a fair and reasonable decision-making process. And I think it's a subtle distinction in your capacity building which really has to emerge at this stage. Now, this capacity building, I'm afraid there is no school for training for such a capacity building. This has to come from the wisdom of men itself. When you occupy an office, that office adds to your responsibility. You grow with the office. And we've seen people who occupy the distinguished office that you hold today have actually grown with office. The day they've occupied this office, or most of you in the states have occupied this office, till the earlier day, you were only civil servants. You were working under ministers. And overnight you started questioning their decisions. How do you reconcile yourself to this change? And therefore, how do you exercise an independence? But while exercising that independence, your activism is tempered with restraint. And therefore, as I said, you question all questionable decisions. you leave footprints of wisdom as far as the future is concerned, so that decisions can improve. But don't allow the system to function in an environment of finger pointing. It's a very tough job to perform. It's a job where a balance has to evolve from your own wisdom. And I'm sure the last 3 days of your conference, as also the day-to-day wisdom that you get out of exercising your functions, will certainly enable you to perform your functions more effectively and hence serve the cause of good governance which any audit inherently does perform. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for sharing your thoughts